There was a pretty big domino that fell today in the world of college football. Pretty big domino. So ESPN, I'm going to get you the boring stuff out of the way first, and I'm going to tell you what it really means. ESPN exercised its option to extend its ACC media rights deal through 2036. So that is as it sounds. ESPN had the option to cancel the thing, I think, after 2027, but they chose, before the deadline, to extend it, which they had the right to do because that's what the grant in rights says they have the right to do. So what that means is they are carrying the ACC media rights through 2036. At least that's what it is on paper right now. And they're paying the amount that the piece of paper says they have to pay and not a dime more. Some members of the ACC have had a big problem with that for obvious reasons, because it puts them in a poverty situation compared to the big programs in the Big Ten and the SEC. Florida State's one of them. Clemson's one of them. In fact, there have been ongoing lawsuits behind the scenes for those programs, despite what they say, to try and get out of the ACC. Now, you gotta have twofold success there. Number one, you got to be able to litigate your way out, and then number two, you got to find a landing spot. That's a much easier said than done. So that's been happening, okay? Then today, this announcement got made. It's not a surprise. This is the way most people I talked to, at least, thought it was going to go. Couple of things to note here, and then I'm going to tell you where I think this is actually going. Florida State, Miami, and Clemson versus Notre Dame is going to happen more regularly. Again, very common sense. They want to maximize the value return on their investment, and they want the big boys playing the big boys more often. Now, I had my first thought, which was, ooh, yeah, that sounds good. That's great for inventory you can put on your shelf there for ESPN. However, if your best teams are playing each other more frequently, does that not increase the potential risk that they knock each other out of playoff spots? The answer in the current format is yes, although you take the risk. But I think the follow-up is it'll be irrelevant because I do believe we're headed towards a world where there are set numbers of auto bid spots for every conference, the ACC included. You don't have to like it, although I may be able to sell you on it, but that's another show. But I do think we're headed that way to where I don't think the ACC or any other conference is going to be so much worried that the strength of their conference schedule is going to knock their good teams out. Because I think they can crystallize the value of playing in the conference. I think they can secure the number of seats they're going to have at the playoff table, and I don't think they have to do it to the detriment of their league schedule. So all that out of the way. There are several important notes here. ESPN extends the ACC deal through 2036. There are several important notes. You have to read this. Ross Dellinger did a really good job on this at Yahoo Sports today. David Hale and Andrea Adelson did a good job over at ESPN. So, a couple of things. The ACC, in conjunction with all this happening, in conjunction with this happening, you're also trying to resolve lawsuits brought forth by the FSUs and Clemsons of the world, and they are looking to resolve those lawsuits twofold. Number one, they're trying to appease their big programs that don't think they're earning enough. FSU's cry is legitimate. FSU's looking and saying, we make you way more money than Boston College or Wake Forest. Why are they getting the same cut of the pie that we are? And then Clemson's like, yeah, for real, us too. We feel the same way. Lawsuit. That's how hard it is. It's just that easy to file a lawsuit. So it looks like behind the scenes there's been a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth here, and it looks like we're headed towards somewhat of a resolution. Now, part of it's already been put in place in the form of success initiatives, and that just means you get rewarded monetarily if you make the playoff, but every conference kind of has that. The ACC also reportedly is looking to take another step in the effort to appease the Florida States and Clemsons of the world enough to back off with their lawsuits, and that is with brand initiatives. And although this has not been made clear, essentially what that would mean is the more watched teams, your Miamis, your Clemsons, your FSUs, we're going to bake in incentives and we're going to bake in a structure where the money pool sort of funnels a little bit more towards them, which makes sense because your Florida States and Clemsons and Miamis look at that and they say, well, wait a second. If we take the money the conference will owe us every year, and then we factor in the success initiative because we think we'll win, and then we also factor in the brand initiative, which means more people watch us. Therefore, we're going to end up making more money because of that. In the aggregate, we can almost close the gap on the big boys. There's not a huge difference in what Michigan will be making or what Georgia will be making or Texas will be making compared to what we could make as long as we take care of business. So, being in the ACC is not so bad after all, as long as that's the structure. Okay, so that's part one. That's the path they're going down. I think they'll get there. Part two, and I really hope this doesn't get buried. It's worth a paper pop. It is the very last paragraph in the ESPN piece on this story today. And I quote, "As part of the settlement, Clemson and Florida State are asking the ACC, pay attention kids, to agree to reduce penalties for exiting the grant of rights after 2031, when TV contracts for the Big Ten and the SEC and the Big 12 are set to expire." What does this mean? I'll tell you what I think it means. What I think it means is Florida State and Clemson, and to a degree Miami, have been able to game this process enough to where in the short term, if they win, they'll be able to make enough to where there's not a massive gap between them and the other halves in the bigger leagues. And in the mid to long term, they're looking to bake in an exit door that is affordable to get out of in 2031. And oh, by the way, the added benefit come 2031 is every other media deal is hitting the open market, which means you're probably looking at one more round of conference realignment. It's just not right around the corner. It's probably a little ways down the road. Now, that is a couple of different angles here, but the third one, this is a mild concern I have for the programs in the ACC, is all that makes sense, okay? Logic is airtight on that. If I'm Florida State and I wanted to get out of the conference, but, you know, the escape hatch wouldn't work and the slide wouldn't inflate and I couldn't get the exact landing spot I want, a solid backup plan is legally go after my conference enough to where they're willing to resolve things with me and I can make a lot more money than I previously was going to make. Okay, that's good enough in the short term, but I also want them to bake in a more affordable and accessible exit door 6 years down the road, and if they agree to that, about the time the open market goes insane, I'm in a pretty good place, right? Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay, not a great place, but a pretty good place. Here's my concern. Alabama has internet. Penn State has internet. They're reading this stuff too. They're watching this with a keen eye as well. Does anyone really think that the bigger brands in the ACC are going to be willing to pull this off to where they disproportionately benefit through brand initiatives and success initiatives, and Georgia's not going to look at that and then look at their league office and say, why don't we have this? You really don't think Ohio State and Michigan look at this and don't look at their league office and say, hold up a second, why don't we earn more than Purdue? They will, and they are. I just don't think it's being written about yet. But common sense tells me that's coming. I've always been uneasy about this. Jamie Pollard's the AD up at Iowa State. He said this a while back. He was dead on the money. And he was kind of tongue-in-cheek talking about how there are people at second and third tier schools in the SEC that just pound their chest and blindly yell SEC. And he was like, who says you'll always be in the SEC? Who says we're not headed for a world where there's either further contraction or there's disproportionate, revenue and income because the big boys demand a bigger slice of the pie. And once the precedent's been established in one league, I don't expect that to be isolated to one league. And here's the problem. If I'm Florida State, let's just say for argument's sake, these are not exact numbers, but let's just say for argument's sake, Ohio State makes $75 million a year. In reality, it's more. But let's say Ohio State makes $75 a year for being in the Big Ten. And let's say South Carolina makes $75 a year for being in the SEC. And I think that if I pool all the potential money I can earn in a year together, I can make $60 million a year. I'm getting close. I'm not matching it, but I'm getting close. Well, that works as long as the status quo remains unchanged. But what if Michigan and Ohio State upset the entire dynamic in the Big Ten? What if Alabama and Texas and Georgia and Florida and whatnot, what if they upset the entire dynamic in the SEC and then they end up earning $95 million per year each, while Vandy only earns $50 per year? What if Michigan earns $95 per year, while, I don't know, Iowa only earns 70 per year. Does that sound crazy? I think it sounds logical. That's the route I try and go down, because the greater good of the conference is not at the forefront anymore. The greater good of the sport is not at the forefront anymore. Now, once we elect me college football commissioner, this will be a moot point. But I don't even know when the election is yet. And the other thing that I just want to point out over there in the ACC, everyone's talking about Florida State, everyone's talking about Clemson, everyone's talking about Miami as the big beneficiary of this new dynamic of success initiatives and brand initiatives. Hey, watch out for Georgia Tech on this. Georgia Tech is like a viper over in the grass right now, because if there's one program over there that could really take off like a rocket if they ever tilt the funnel of revenue their way a little bit, it's that team that exists in your biggest media market there at the intersection of the ACC and the SEC in Atlanta, Georgia. The team that has continued to send little trimmers throughout the ACC the past couple of years. Brent Key, Georgia Tech getting their act together about the time the league implements a revenue distribution program that could disproportionately benefit you and enrich you the more success you have. It sounds like it benefits Florida State and Miami and Clemson more. But you know what else it sounded like? It sounded like when they built this league in the current format it is, that it would just be Miami versus Florida State every year. And it hadn't been that a single time. So things aren't always as they appear in the ACC. So yes, of course this is designed to appease 2 or 3 schools. That doesn't mean another school couldn't just throw water on the entire computer and take advantage of it themselves. They absolutely could.